Good evening and welcome to the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel. My name is Annie and I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which, if you're not familiar with us, is an independent bookstore based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we're very pleased to be here tonight with authors Natasha Lester and Kate Quinn, speaking about Natasha's new book, The Riviera House. We are so happy to have you. If it's your first virtual event with Majors and Quinn, thank you so much for supporting an independent bookstore's author event. If it's not your first event with us, welcome back. It's great to have you. If you are interested in purchasing copies of The Riviera House or Kate Quinn's book, The Rose Code, we have them at Majors and Quinn, and I will put the store's phone number and contact information in the chat. Speaking of the chat, that is where you can ask questions of the authors. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the hour here today. And also just say hi, let us know where you're watching from. Natasha is coming to us from the future, from Australia, where it is currently Tuesday. And Kate is coming to us from the West Coast. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, two of you, for being here. I am going to introduce the two speakers, and then I'll be back at the end of the hour for questions. So first off, we have Natasha Lester, who worked as a marketing executive for L'Oreal before penning the New York Times and internationally best-selling novel, The Paris Orphan. She is also the author of the USA Today bestseller, The Paris Seamstress. When she's not writing, she loves collecting vintage fashion, traveling, reading, practicing yoga, and playing with her 3 children. Natasha lives in Perth, Western Australia. Thank you for being here, Natasha.
Thank you for having me.
And Kate Quinn is a New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction, a native of Southern California. She attended Boston University, where she earned a bachelor's and master's degree in classical voice. She's written 4 novels in the Empress of Rome saga and 2 books in the Italian Renaissance before turning to the 20th century with The Alice Network, The Huntress, and The Rose Code. All have been translated into multiple languages. Kate and her husband now live in San Diego with 3 rescue dogs. Kate, thank you so much for being the conversation partner for this event. We're so happy to have you both, and I will be back later in the night. Have fun.
Thanks, Annie.
All right, we are alone and unsupervised. This is the fun part. Well, I know it's like 8 a.m. where you are. I have no idea how you look that fresh and gorgeous and put together at 8 a.m. But here's a cup of coffee I've got. So coffee and cheers, and let's celebrate your new launch, because this is such a fabulous book.
Oh, thank you so much, Kate. And actually, 8 a.m. is quite civilized. I've had a couple at 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. So by 8 o'clock, I'm like, yes, I'm fine by then.
All right. Now, for everybody who's watching, and, we will keep this conversation spoiler free about the book. We'll talk about the history behind it and, the writing, the inspiration, all of that. But it will be spoiler free for those who haven't read yet. But do you want to give us a quick sort of elevator pitch for what this book is about, just to give our folks here some grounding?
Of course. So the main character is Eliane, and she's an art lover who lives in Paris. And right before the occupation of Paris in the Second World War, she's working at the Louvre Museum. But once the Germans occupy the city, she's asked to move to a different Parisian art museum, one called the Jeu de Paume, which, when she approaches the museum on her first day, she's shocked to discover it's guarded by armed Nazis, and that inside the museum is so much art, more art than any of the best museums in the world could possibly gather together for an exhibition. She has no idea where the art has come from, why it's there, and what purpose it's been gathered together for. She meets a woman called Rose Valland at the museum, and together the 2 women begin to work on spying on the Nazis who are actually stealing all of the private art collections owned by the Jewish families of France. It's a dangerous mission, puts both of their lives at risk, but I'm not going to tell you what happens to them because that would be a spoiler.
All right, great. Now, the Riviera House opens with a scene which is set during the evacuation of the Louvre in August of 1939, as the enormous winged victory statue is moved down a staircase. Now, that I really had my heart in my throat, because I was wondering, I couldn't remember, does it break? Does it not? So did that really happen? And can you tell us about how and why the Louvre was evacuated for really the first time in its history?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's quite astonishing. Probably lots of people watching have been to the Louvre and have seen how many artworks there are in that former palace. But in August 1939, Monsieur Jacques Jaujat, who was the director of the museum, he had seen what Hitler had done in the other territories he had occupied around Europe, and he was worried about the fate of France's national artwork collection. So he decided to preemptively evacuate the Louvre. Of course, actually, a few days later, war was declared, so he did it at just the right time. So he called in everybody he could think of, art students from the École du Louvre, all of the curators who were working at the Louvre, the women who worked at the Grand Magasin du Louvre, even workers from La Samaritaine, one of the department stores. So the museum was full of all these people, full of packing materials, and he asked them all to pack every single thing in the Louvre that could possibly be moved. So they took paintings out of their frames and rolled them around oak columns. And he devised this system of kind of coding the paintings with a series of coloured dots. And so most of the paintings and artworks had one dot on their cases. Very precious artworks like the French crown jewels, for example, had 2 dots on their cases. And there was one artwork, of course, the Mona Lisa, that had 3 dots on her case. So she was packed up as well. She was moved off down to the countryside along with all the artworks. And then there was the Winged Victory, as you mentioned. And she was a massive statue. So she's made of marble. She stands more than 5 meters tall. If anyone's been to the Louvre and you've walked up that beautiful Daru staircase, the very grand staircase, a central kind of piece of the Louvre, right at the top is the Winged Victory. And they had to devise this system of pulleys and ropes and ramps to move her. So they constructed a kind of a frame around her, literally hoisted her up into the air, and then set her down on this ramp that ran down the staircase. And when I was reading accounts of that, the people who, basically everybody gathered at the bottom of the staircase to watch this, because you can imagine what it must have been like. And for me, it was like the symbolism inherent in that moment, a statue named Victory being lowered down a staircase, kind of step by step, and everybody watching that. And so it wasn't just, okay, it would be a tragedy, obviously, if this statue fell or broke somehow, but the statue being named Victory, it would have been even more of a symbolic kind of blow to the heart, I suppose, if she had have fallen or broken. So when I saw those pictures, which there are plenty of pictures at the Musée National Archives that I looked through, and then read those accounts, I thought I have to shape that into a scene, because, you know, part of the story of the book is about the power of art to inspire us, I suppose, at dark moments of our lives or dark moments of history. And it just seemed as if this one moment could really encapsulate not only the evacuation of the Louvre and how that felt to people, the emptying of the kind of the central museum of Paris's artistic culture, but also the way in which this statue was lovingly and carefully moved down a staircase with everybody watching with their hearts quite literally in their mouths. So yeah, it was a lot of fun to write that scene and kind of, you know, drill into how it might have felt to have been one of those people at the bottom of the staircase watching her descend.
I thought there were such conflicting emotions in that scene, because there is that feeling of, like, you know, the heart in the mouth, like, if it falls, that's a terrible omen. I don't think any of us, you know, despite how modern we think of ourselves, quite get past the sensation of omens in our lives.
Yes.
But then there's also that flat feeling of defeat that, like, you have to move this thing. It's like the heart of the museum is leaving it, and the museum itself is so much a heart of France. And yet also there's a sort of vicious pleasure in it at the same time. It's like, okay, Nazis, you might get Paris, but you're not getting this. So it's like, I thought it was a great scene because there are so many emotions just wrapped up in one statue, and really that encapsulates so much about art and why it's important to us, and how, like, look at the way we've been calling the statue a she.
I know. It's a woman, absolutely.
We're not even French. It's not even our national statue, but it's like, it's the way that these things can literally come to life.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, the pictures that are probably the most heartbreaking almost from that time are the ones showing the empty Louvre. You know, there are all that, the grand gallery, which is that long gallery that's normally both sides are covered in paintings, it's empty. There's nothing there at all, and it's quite eerie. And then in other rooms, there are stacks of the frames, because they took the canvases out of the frames, and just the frames are left stacked against the walls. And written on the walls in chalk marks are the names of the painting and the artist, so that when the paintings are returned, they can remember kind of where they were hung. And those chalk marks are quite ghostly, as are, you can see on the walls how there are rectangles of unfaded paint, because they've had a painting on them the whole time and the rest of the paint is faded by the sun, but this rectangle of paint hasn't. So you can kind of see the ghosts of the paintings in a way in those pictures. They're quite affecting photos, actually. So yeah, it was really interesting research to do there.
So the book is largely about the theft of art by the Nazis from Jewish families in France during World War II, these private collections that were just looted from private homes. So can you tell us more about these events and how you've incorporated them into your story?
Of course. So essentially, the Nazis had shown, as they took over Austria and Czechoslovakia and all those other countries, that they were on the lookout for art, and they had begun thieving art across many countries in Europe. So not just France, but the Riviera House focuses on what happened in France. So immediately after the occupation, the Nazis decreed, to read this ruling is probably one of the more shocking things I've ever read in my life, where they declare that the Jewish people are like cattle. So therefore they're not human, and therefore they have no rights. And if they have no rights, they can't have possessions. So all of their previous possessions are now goods without owners, and goods without owners can therefore be taken by anybody. And so this was this terrible rationale that the Nazis published, which they felt enabled them to then go ahead and take, they didn't call it stealing, we would call it stealing obviously, these private art collections owned by the Jewish families. Because there were two Nazis in particular who were very focused on art. Adolf Hitler had these plans to build what he called the Führer Museum in Germany once the war had been finished and he was the victor. And Hermann Goering, his second in command, had a grand country home called Carinol, which he planned to fit out as the second largest art museum in the world after Adolf Hitler's Führer Museum. And so both men had their eyes on art from the outset. And once they had declared the Jewish-owned collections to be goods without owners, they began to gather them up, and they needed somewhere to store them. They initially kept them in a basement in the Louvre, but they ran out of room, so they requisitioned the Jeu de Paume Museum, and they moved all of the artworks there. Around 20,000 pieces of art in total transited through the Jeu de Paume Museum over the course of the war. Paintings like Vermeer's Astronomer, which now hangs in the Louvre, Picasso's, Van Gogh's, Rembrandt's, basically any famous artist you can think of, at least some of their work transited through the Jeu de Paume over the course of the war. They sent them to the museum where they catalogued them, they sorted them, and then Goering came to visit the museum 22 times over the course of the war to hand select paintings for his home at Carinol. Hitler obviously he thought other things to do, so he sent art historians to the museum to pick the paintings for him. And after the first visit that Goering made to the museum, and he realised the quantity of artistic treasure that he had now had access to, he issued a decree where he basically categorised who could take these paintings. Category number 1, of course, was Hitler. He had to defer to his boss. Category number 2 was Goering. He had second choice from what was left after Hitler's historians had taken what he wanted. And then there were 3 other categories of Nazi officials who could come to the museum and basically just take these paintings that weren't theirs to take, that were owned by other people. So it was quite a tragic story. In fact, it's widely regarded as being the largest plunder of artwork in the whole history of mankind, and art has been plundered a lot over the centuries, as you know. So the scale of it's quite enormous, and there are still thousands of pieces missing today. Regularly, there are stories appearing in newspapers of families who see a painting of theirs pop up in an art auction, and it's unfortunately the onus has been for a long time on them to prove that they owned it. Those things are changing now, and restitution is becoming slightly easier. But, it's a heartbreaking story that has resonance even today.
Yeah, trying to prove that you owned a painting when pretty much everything you had was destroyed or confiscated. Yeah, good luck with that. So I'm very glad to know that restitution is becoming at least a little bit easier for the families involved.
Yeah, it is. You're right. They had nothing left. They literally had everything taken from them. And also, it was decades ago, and the people who actually had collected the paintings often are now dead. So it's their sons, daughters, granddaughters who are now having to step up and try to find some way of showing that, oh, here's a photograph of our house from the 1940s, and you can see that painting on the wall in the background and things like that. It's quite tragic.
So you've once again written a story around an incredible real-life woman from history. So tell us about Rose Valland. Who was she? How were you inspired by her? What is her role in the Riviera House? Because as soon as I was done reading your book, I went to her Wikipedia page and I just read through that with like my jaw on the floor. I was so astonished.
Yeah, she's an amazing woman. I mean, I love, like you, finding these women in history whose roles have been overlooked and who history has kind of forgotten, and bringing them, back to people's notice, hopefully. And so I first came across Rose a couple of years ago, and I was immediately intrigued by the idea of a woman risking her life for art, because so often the stories we hear of the French resistance are about people risking their lives to save other people, whether they be, downed Allied pilots or Jewish families, etc. And I hadn't kind of come across this aspect of the war before. So I began to research Rose, and the instant I started, knew immediately I had to write about this woman, because she was extraordinary. So she was the curator at the Jeu de Paume Museum before the Nazis occupied Paris. They demoted her to the position of caretaker and basically had her there, checking the heating and the fire extinguishers and taking out their trash and doing that kind of stuff when she was, an art historian and curator. But she saw immediately what was happening with these paintings and these artworks that were coming through the Jeu de Paume Museum. And she decided that she would take on the responsibility of recording all of the details of those artworks. So she told the Germans that she didn't speak their language, that she could only speak French, but she could speak German. And so for 4 years, she eavesdropped on every conversation she could. She read all of their records and she took her own notes. And of course, for us looking back now, we know that the war ended after 4 years. But for Rose, she had no idea. She had no idea whether the occupation could continue for 10 years or 20 years or forever. So really, what she was doing was even more extraordinary, because her hope was that she would be able to help restore these artworks to their rightful owners once the war ended, if she took good enough records. But she didn't actually know whether that was ever going to happen. So it was this huge act of faith, actually, to go, I'm going to do this, even though I don't know for sure if I'm ever going to be able to use these notes that I'm risking my life to gather. So I just loved that kind of dedication. She was the only French person there at the museum. They fired all the French staff. They kept Rose on because she knew the museum. And so she had these notebooks where she would record all of the details of the paintings that had been stored there, who the original owners were, if she knew who the original owners were, the artist's name, a description of the artwork if she didn't know what the piece was called, and also where it was being sent, because she knew they were being sent to these coded destinations around Europe to be kept safe until the fighting was over. So she had to find the code books to work out what those coded locations were. And she discovered that there were places like the Schloss Neuschwanstein, which is that fairy tale castle that the Cinderella castle at Disneyland is based on. So it was that one. So that stored all these artistic treasures for a number of years. And she would smuggle home at night, in her clothes, the negatives. So the art historians would photograph all the paintings that came through the museum to put them into Goering's catalogue. And so Rose would steal the negatives at night, take them home. She found a friend who had a photography studio who would develop the negatives for her into prints, and then she would smuggle the negatives back in the next day. And so she had this kind of photographic record as well of the paintings that had been stolen. So, it was extraordinary. And so after the war, she then joined the Allied Art Looting and Investigation Unit and showed them all of her record books and worked with them to go and track down the paintings from Neuschwanstein and the salt mines and all the other places and restored them to their rightful owners. And they estimate that Rose probably helped recover about 45,000 out of 60,000 artworks that had been stolen. That's a pretty big number for one woman who was literally operating on faith for the whole 4 years, risking her life to look after these artworks. And the funny thing about Rose is, she kind of, played the part of this very demure, quiet woman. She kept her hair kind of scraped back in a bun and had glasses and sort of, skulked around the museum, I guess, in a way. And she was fired 4 times over the course of the war because something would go wrong and they would just blame her and they would tell her she was sacked. And so she'd go home for 2 weeks and then she'd just reappear at the museum without being invited and would just slink back in. And, then she'd just be sitting at her desk very quietly, very demurely, and the Nazis would kind of forget that they had fired her. And so she was able to kind of, just keep going, even though they kept firing her. And at one point, in fact, Colonel von Boer, who ran the ERR, the German art looting unit, he told her he would take her to the border and liquidate her. So she knew that her life was on the line, but she kept going. So pretty extraordinary woman and an extraordinary story, and one I loved writing about in the Riviera House.
I love that whole image because, she was, you see the photographs of her and she is this very, you would think of, you could just imagine the Nazis looking at her, it's like, just some ugly middle-aged woman with glasses, what
exactly
is some little middle-aged woman with glasses ever going to be a threat? And, it's like, of course she's a threat, but the best people who are threats are the ones that just slide by like mice underneath. I mean,
Absolutely.
The best spies, I always think of that because, it's like having written about women spies in war, it's not the James Bond thing where, the woman spy is the one who's slinking through the cocktail party in a satin dress and she's the center of all eyes. It's like the woman who's the spy in the room is the one who's going around the edges with like a tray of canapes or, a clipboard like Rose, and, just no one notices them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that, comes from almost Hollywood in a way where, of course, the spy's got to be this glamorous, slinking woman. But in fact, mostly she was not. She was like Rose, and Rose, Rose was amazing.
She really was. I really encourage you to look her up for viewers if you have not. Now, you did mention this a little bit earlier, but the Mona Lisa with her 3 dots on the case is another artwork that, of course, readers are familiar with and that definitely plays a part in this book. And she had quite an adventure of her own during the war. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you wove those events into the Riviera House?
Yeah, she did. So, there were so many stories of so many artworks that had this very interesting story during the war. It was almost hard to kind of narrow them down and just focus on a few. But, of course, everyone knows the Mona Lisa. So when I started to read about her journey, I thought, all right, I have to write her into the book as well. So she had this special crate with these 3 dots, the only painting with 3 dots on her case. And, she was evacuated out of the Louvre on an ambulance stretcher so that she would be protected, which I just love that image of what happened there. And she went out with a letter. So all of the other artworks were coded so that they could be identified later on. The codes on the crate matched a set of papers that were, typed out in quadruplicate with the records of the codes for each painting. The Mona Lisa went out with a half code. She went out with just the letters MN on her crate. And she went out with a letter to a man called Pierre Chaume, who was at the Chateau de Chambord, which was the first kind of triage centre, I guess, for all the artworks that were coming from the Louvre. And the letter was from Monsieur Jacques Jorjard, the director of the Louvre, and he asked Pierre Chaume to write the letters LPO onto her crate. And it was only the 2 of them and a couple of other people who knew that the Mona Lisa's crate was the one marked LPO. That was the only crate. It didn't matter what happened during the war, whatever, if anyone ever tried to pass off a painting as a Mona Lisa when it was a fraud or if she was stolen, they would be able to find her because her crate was specially marked in this way. And I loved that idea that there was this kind of secret code. And, being a writer, you know what it's like. There's a code. We're like, yes, I'm right there. So that idea of this kind of code in 2 parts was just too good not to kind of mimic in another part of the story, which again I won't talk about, but just to kind of flag that that's where that idea sort of came from, I suppose. But the Mona Lisa, she got moved about 5 or 6 times throughout the course of the war because paintings, there's all kinds of things that can damage paintings, flood and fire and humidity and rats and everything like that. And these chateaux they were being stored in had all of those things going on. So there was one particular story where she had been kept at the Loc-Dieu Abbey in the south of France for a number of months, and it's very humid in the abbey, and the Mona Lisa is actually painted on wood, not canvas. So wood and humidity are not friends. So they decided they needed to move her to a different chateau where the humidity would be better for her. And because the humidity had been an issue, they put her in the back of a hermetically sealed van to transport her, so there wouldn't be any humidity on the journey, which is fine for the Mona Lisa, but they also put into the back of the van an art curator to accompany her. Now, a hermetically sealed van is not so good for a human being because there's no oxygen in a hermetically sealed van.
Oh,
so
dear.
I know, you know where this is going, right? So by the time the van pulled up at the next chateau where the Mona Lisa was going to live, Mona Lisa was still smiling. She was absolutely fine, but the curator was unconscious from the lack of oxygen.
Oh God, I feel horrible for laughing.
I know, same.
It's like, oh dear.
Every time I tell this story, I can't help but laugh, and then I say it's terrible because, for me, that story just illustrated how much these curators were willing to risk for the sake of these artworks. They were absolutely, literally willing to put their lives on the line for something like the Mona Lisa. So, and I think that for me, one of the best parts of going back to the Louvre to do the research for this book was walking past the Mona Lisa and not just seeing, the smile and the eyebrows and all that sort of thing, but the story of what had happened to her during the war. And, the same with Vermeer's Astronomer, walking past that at the Louvre and knowing that has a swastika stamped on its back because it transited through the Jeu de Paume. So, I wish some of those stories were on the plaques of the paintings at the Louvre, because I think those kinds of stories really help bring these artworks even more to life and show how important they are and how much people have been willing to risk for them. So yes, the Mona Lisa is not just a smiling lady on a piece of wood. She had quite the adventure during the Second World War.
All right, now mostly we've talked about Paris so far, which is where a great deal of the book takes place, but there's also the French Riviera. And there are some gorgeous settings in this book, which is one of its great pleasures because, if you're like me, still more or less haven't, in lockdown, in the sense of you have not had any, fantastic visits to anywhere as nice as the French Riviera in the last year and a half. It's nice to at least visit them virtually. So that's an absolute pleasure of this book, is just the being able to soak in these gorgeous settings. So can you talk a little bit about some of these real places that you've used to inspire the settings in the story?
Of course. So yes, if you're going to write a book called The Riviera House, it's essential as a novelist that you travel to the Riviera to fully immerse yourself in the Riviera way of life, to write about it authentically. So I was very lucky that I did the research.
And all the glasses of rosé that you drink are tax deductible, and it's
absolutely. Definitely. I was really lucky. I did the research for this in December 2018. So before shutdowns, back when travel was a thing that we did unthinkingly. And what I wanted to do was a couple of things. I knew I wanted the book to center around this house on the French Riviera, but I didn't know which Riviera town I wanted that house to be set in. I had a couple of ideas, but I wasn't really sure. So
you have no choice but to visit them all.
Exactly. It meant doing a very thorough reconnaissance of all the beautiful Riviera towns. At least that's how I sold it to my husband. In fact, I'm laughing, but we stayed at which is now a hotel, but it was once a villa owned by F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, which was quite amazing and quite the literary inspiration, I must say. We had one of those. It's quite an old building, obviously, being owned by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It had one of those, those creaking iron cage elevators, and my kids were just terrified of this elevator and wouldn't step foot in it the whole time we were staying there. But I was just going, F. Scott Fitzgerald once was in here. So that was quite fun. And then I did my kind of reconnaissance around all the Riviera towns, and I went to a town called Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat primarily because I had read about a house there called the Villa Ephrussi de Rothschild, which was Beatrice de Rothschild's home. And I thought maybe it would inspire me to be able to visualize my Riviera house a little bit more, thoroughly. And as soon as I walked up to the house, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not just going to use it to inspire my house. This is my house because it's pink. I mean, a pink house. Come on, you've got to write about a pink house, right? And so it's magnificent. It's pink, and the gardens just stretch for miles. And so if you're reading the book and you see the pink house in the book, you'll know to go and Google photographs of the Villa Ephrussi de Rothschild, because essentially that is the model of my Riviera house. So everything from the water cascades that lead up to the Love Temple, that's a model of the Petit Trianon at Versailles. That's in the actual villa. It's in my book. The rose gardens, the lapidary gardens, the Japanese gardens, all of those things I have taken from real life and put into my story here, because it was like, I don't actually think I can imagine anything better than this. So I'm going to use this as my model for my house, which was lots of fun to be able to just snap photographs and then, over the next few months, refer back to those photos and kind of unravel the story around this kind of mansion. I also visited, again, if you're reading the book, Remy and Adam, the main characters in the contemporary storyline, visit the town of Ayers one day, which is one of those perched medieval villages that there's a few of them through the Riviera. They were obviously built up high on hills as fortification, back in the medieval times. And this village still exists perched up on this hill, and it's quite the stunner of a French village. Like if you're going to imagine the most amazing French village you can think of, Ayers would come right near the top, I think. And, so as soon as I walked into Ayers, I thought, oh, I have to write about this village. People are going to love this. I love this. And so Remy and Adam explore the town. Essentially, it's a maze of narrow streets, and they walk down a street and decide on a whim whether they'll go right, left, or straight ahead, because that's what me and my 3 kids did when we were wandering through Ayers. We were all walking around open-mouthed and just had that sense of just wanting to be lost in this space. So we would get to the end of a road and go, okay, right, left, or straight ahead, and we'd take turns choosing and just, winding our way through the town. So it was very hard not to be inspired by all of these gorgeous locales, and it was lots of fun recreating them in the story.
So I was going to ask you about the research anyway, and I noticed that Lisa Marshall also wanted to know how does the research go really for works of historical fiction like this? How do you get started? How do you manage the info? We're talking here, of course, not just about I have to go to the French Riviera and go to all these places, but the more mundane research when you have to just go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So I always find the research, I love the research. So, put me in a dusty archive and I'm pretty happy. But for me, I have to have some idea of the story before I do a lot of the research, because I'm a bit of a, in writing terms, I'm the pantser kind of writer, not the plotter kind of writer. So I have to have a bit of a first draft going before I know what to focus my research on. It kind of helps me with my scope, I suppose. So for this one, I did sit in plenty of dusty archives. So the Musée National Archives have all of Rose's original notebooks from the war, so the ones where she recorded all the details of the paintings. So I went to the archives and looked at all of those, and that's why I love archives. How marvelous is it to be able to sit down with Rose's notebooks and look at her recording of all of these details that she was doing, back in 1941, 42, 43, 44. So I looked through all of those. But Rose was a bit of a challenge in some ways. And this is why I created the character of Eliane to work alongside Rose, because I didn't feel I could authentically make Rose the main character, because she was a hard woman to pin down. She did write a memoir, which is only published in French. Luckily, I do speak French, so I did make my way through her memoir. And it's a very precise, detailed memoir of the day-to-day of what happened in the Jeu de Paume Museum, but she never takes you outside the museum. So you never travel with Rose to her home, to her weekends, to see her friends, to find out how she spent her time. So it was very much just the business of spying on the Nazis is recorded in this memoir. And I thought, well, that's going to be difficult to shape her as a character if I don't know what she did outside of the museum. I need the book to move outside the museum, obviously, as well as being in the museum. So to me, it felt like I'd have to make up so much that I perhaps couldn't really call her Rose Valland anymore. So that was why I stepped kind of Eliane in beside her to walk alongside her, and then tried to keep Rose as being this very private, reserved woman as she appears in her memoir. So there were a couple of things I tried to do, because of course you still have to, describe in some ways or show the reader how Rose might feel in the situations that she was in the museum. And so I went to the Jeu de Paume Museum to kind of help me get a sense of what it might have been like to be her in that place at that time. And there were two things, I suppose, that happened while I was there doing the research. I had a floor plan of the way the gallery was set out during the Second World War, because it's obviously the interior is very different now. The exterior is the same. And one of the rooms in the galleries, Rose had called the Salle des Martyrs, which was where the Nazis stored all the paintings they called degenerate. So the Nazis had a very specific definition of what they thought constituted art, and Impressionist, modernist works were to them not artistic, they were degenerate. And so they were stored in this special room, the Room of the Martyrs, as Rose called it. And so I could see on my plan where that was located, and I went and found that place in the museum, and I just stood there very quietly when I was there. And again, maybe this sounds a bit kind of woohoo and out there, but it feels quite haunted, that place. It's almost like you can feel, that something happened there, and the memory of that still lingers in the space a little bit. So that, just her naming it the Room of the Martyrs and getting that sensation of what that space still feels like was one way of helping me kind of access Rose, I suppose. And the other moment was the Jeu de Paume has these beautiful arched windows along one side that look out over the Eiffel Tower, in fact. And the night I was there, the sun was setting, the sky was this amazing golden orange, and you look through the arched window at the Eiffel Tower, this, symbol of France against this golden sky. And all I could think was, gosh, imagine being Rose and looking out at that same view of this, symbol of your country, and knowing you had an armed Nazi behind you who was going to kill you if he found out you were spying on him, and how different that scene might have looked to her than it did to me, decades later. So the research is sometimes sitting in the archive trying to discover the character through her records, and at other times finding other ways to piece together their thoughts and feelings, perhaps how they might have felt at that time.
So I always know that, we have to kill our darlings in the editing stage. Was there anything that you regretted having to leave on the cutting room floor, or do you feel, or did it pretty much, if you wanted it in there, did it get in there?
Oh, no, I had a whole character I had to excise from the manuscript. Oh. I know. So I had a whole different kind of point of view character in there at one point, and I loved her. Her name was Inez, and I still love her now, you can tell. But I just didn't need her as much as I loved her. And I needed her at the start to help me work out how to write the story. As the story grew, she kind of became redundant, and it was just because I loved her that she clung on for so long by her fingertips. And in the end, I had to say, no, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go into that place where all of my killed off characters now live. So there was that. And there was also, I did have quite a bit more about the Mona Lisa threaded into the story, which again was fascinating research, fascinating background information, but not essential for the story. And like you, I think we've had this conversation before, books always tend to get long and unwieldy when we're writing them. And so to kind of get it down to a manageable length, I did have to get rid of those things. So I don't regret it, because I look at the book now and think, no, it's perfect the way it is. But of course you do look back on those things and think, oh, but they were just so much fun.
So did you have a favorite scene when you were writing this book? Is there any particular one that you enjoyed?
Oh, that's a very good question, isn't it? Favorite scene? I suppose I really liked in this book I've never, and I was joking about this. It's a terrible thing to joke about. The things writers joke about. I was joking about this with Julia Kelly, another author, a couple of weeks ago, and we were saying that we often make sure our characters don't have much in the way of family around them. We've kind of killed off their parents or their siblings, or because they just.
You're trying to keep the cast manageable. It's like, how can you kill off as many people as possible so you clear the stage?
Exactly. And we said that's a macabre and terrible thing to joke about, but it makes your life easier as a writer in some ways. And so in this book, for the first time, I had a character who I wanted to have this big family. And so Eliane has 4 sisters and 1 brother. She's got this big family around her because, I'd wanted to kind of look at the implications of, the Nazis passed this law in 1942, which said that anyone found involved in acts of resistance, it wasn't just them who would be punished for it. It was their whole family. They would all be arrested and killed and tortured for those activities. So it meant that you had to think very carefully about what you were doing, because you weren't just putting your life in danger, you're putting the lives of everyone you loved in danger. And so I think it's some of those scenes with Eliane and her sisters actually that are my favourites, because I haven't been able to do that in many books in the past, but it works so well in this book that, especially Eliane's littlest sister, Yolande, she has a very special place in my heart as well. So those are quite lovely and quite fun. And then I guess in the contemporary storyline, favourite scenes would be probably those ones where Adam and Remy are recreating some vintage Louise Dahl Wolfe photographs for Remy's vintage fashion business. I've been a huge admirer of Louise Dahl Wolfe's photography for a long time, and so being able to kind of weave her work into the book was lots of fun, and I really loved writing those scenes too.
All right, now I think we're going to go to Q&A pretty soon, but I thought one more question just before we invite Q&A, and do put your question in the side if you would like to. I know we've had some in there already, but I know one question which is bound to come up, so let's just ask now, is what are you writing next after Riviera House? Although I know that's a little bit of a loaded question for writers, because sometimes you just put a book out and you're like, oh, it's out. And then people say they read it and they love it. What's next? And you're like, can I get 2 weeks off?
I know. It's always lovely when someone says, oh, I read it in one day. And you're like, but it took me 2 years to write.
I know.
But it is lovely. We love hearing that. So I'm working on a book that I wanted to, in this one, I'd focus a lot on women during the war. I wanted to look at women after the war, because I think that whilst the war was a huge time of change for women, so was what happened to women after the war, where they had been, working, earning their own money, gaining their independence, and in fact, in many cases, doing some really extraordinary things like spying on Nazis and various other people. And then after the war, the government ran those propaganda campaigns to say, no, you need to quit your job, give your job back to the men, and go home and cook roast dinners for your husband. But gosh, what would that have felt like to have been a spy or something and then to be told to go and cook roast chicken dinners? So the book is largely set post-Second World War, and it's told through the eyes of the public relations director for the newly opened House of Christian Dior in Paris in 1947. So it has a bit of a fashionable storyline in there too, as my books are wont to do.
Well, that sounds wonderful, and I know we can't wait for that. But right now, we will keep talking about taking questions for the Riviera House. And believe me, if there aren't questions, I can keep going. But if I did see some in the side, I can pull those out. Or Annie, if you would like to feed those to us, that sounds good.
Hi, yeah, I'm happy to. We already have some great questions. And if you haven't asked your question yet, do it now so we can get to it, hopefully. First one I see is from David. I wonder what coping mechanisms or strategies you use to mitigate the effects of secondary trauma from the distressing and troubling content that you must encounter in your research.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, in a way, I'm very lucky. I have 3 bright, bubbly children who are instant mood boosters, and I've sort of finished my writing day at around 3:30 when they all tumble back home from school. And so I open the doors of my office and walk out, and they are full of smiles and laughter and happiness, and can't wait to tell me every minute detail of what happened to them at school that day. So very quickly you're able to kind of move out of those things and focus on my kids in my case. So that's actually quite wonderful, because, sometimes you are reading some things and you just, you know, like you're literally weeping yourself, and then you have to write those things into a story, and it can be really, but I get, you know, you're always thinking, you know, all I have to do is read about these things. I didn't have to live these things like the people who did live through these things in the war. So there's always that perspective too of, gosh, how lucky am I that I have not lived through a war in the way that these women did. So I think a couple of things like that really helped me to kind of keep my perspective. I don't know, what about you, Kate? What do you think of that?
That is one of those things. You can research some stuff that is very hard to read, but on the other hand, I do have the feeling of, well, for one thing, if you have chosen to write about something that is as traumatic and as, you know, as something that continues to be delicate in the memory and, you know, to so many, like the Holocaust, or, you know, for more recent things like the Armenian Massacre, or, you know, any kind of history that is, you know, such a cultural wound, there is the sense of you have to be responsible, and you have to be delicate, and you have to bear, and, you know, in a way you have to bear witness. You know, if you've chosen to write about this, you have to do it well, which means you owe it to the people who are gone to dive deep and do this research right, and not just, you know, like throw a few details into the book and call it a day. So you have to dig in, you have to do it right. And so that's how I feel about it. And so when you do dive in, you have to do it well. You have to be thorough. And after that, I'm probably pouring a stiff drink and playing with my dogs for a while, and hoping to get some laughter back in that way, because it is really hard sometimes to dive into particularly ugly parts of history.
Yeah. Here is another one for both of you from Sharon. Do you ever find anything so interesting in researching one book that you end up writing another book about it, or putting it somewhere else because it's so good?
I'd like to know that for Natasha, because I want to know if Inez is going to end up in a different book if you liked her so much.
Oh, she might well, but basically that person has just described my entire writing process. So that is exactly how I find my next story ideas. It's in the research that I'm doing for a previous book. So when I was writing The Paris Secret, my last book, where I'm writing about Catherine Dior, who was a resistante. That's where I read about Rose Valland as well in Anne Seber's book, Les Parisiennes, How the Women of Paris Lived, Loved and Died in the 1940s. Anne Seber talks about both Catherine Dior and Rose Valland in that book. And I immediately wrote down the name Rose Valland in I always have a very short list of next book ideas. And so Rose went in there straight away. And then in writing the Riviera House, I got the idea for the next book. And then in writing the next book, I've got the idea for the next book. So the research is, you know, fruitful in many ways, not just to help you write your existing book, but to help you then drill down and find the next idea for the next book. Because I'm really a one idea at a time writer. I hear writers who have, you know, lists of ideas, and I'm green with envy because I'm always scared that I'm never going to have another idea for a book because there's only ever one. And it's like, what if the publisher hates that idea? I don't know what I'm going to do. How about you, Kate?
I do tend to have lists of ideas, and, you know, it's like pages long. It's stuff that probably I'll never get around to writing. It might not even be the kind of thing that I write. But it is true that sometimes, quite often, in fact, research does yield an idea for the future. And I've had, like, just the most recently, I had, when I was researching the Night Witches, which is the all-female bomber regiment who flew against Hitler from the Soviet Union. When I was researching the Night Witches, it led me down a whole rabbit for the book, The Huntress. It led me down a whole rabbit hole about Russian women war heroes, because Russian women, unlike French or American, English, other allied women, they were actually allowed to serve as soldiers in the front line. And when I went down that rabbit hole about Russian women war heroes, I learned about a woman female sniper who was the most successful and effective of all time for women snipers. And as soon as I learned about her and the fact that she had the nickname Lady Death, and the fact that she had racked up a tally of 309 Nazis in like a year of fighting, I thought, all right, I've got to write a book about her. And that's my next book. It's which is called The Diamond Eye, which is coming out in March of next year. So yes, sometimes the research does kick up a new idea. And the thing is, your muse has a tendency to run with it, because I don't know if your muse is like mine, Natasha, but my muse gets bored midway through, especially when the book is a little bit of a slog. So she wants to start in entertaining herself with other newer, brighter, shinier things. So therefore, it's kind of like, that's when she's likely to kick up new ideas at me, because she wants me to do something else because she's bored. And so therefore, it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe you're in a relationship and that it's going through a little bit of a bad patch. Your significant other is in a period where they're just sitting on the couch sullenly all the time eating Cheetos. And that's exactly when, like Alexander Skarsgård knocks on your door with a bottle of champagne and a hotel room key. And you're like, no, I cannot do this. But that's when they drop by. That's what I think of as like the muse throwing me a new, bright, shiny new book idea, right when I really need to be getting in the trenches with the current book and not the next book.
Yes, and in some ways I'm kind of glad that I only have the one idea, because I think that if I had more than one, I would be so distracted by all of them and want to write them all other than the one I'm working on. And can I just say how gorgeous is the cover for The Diamond Eye? If anyone watching hasn't seen the cover, immediately go onto Google and Google The Diamond Eye and look at the cover for Kate's next book.
Oh, I love it. It's great. Your cover is awesome too. You have a beautiful cover for the Riviera House. It really makes me want to step right in.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just Googling.
Good.
All right. So I did see a question from Lisa about the research process, but I think we may have
I think we answered that.
Yeah, she has a comment follow-up saying thank you. So Lisa, if there was anything you wanted to drill down further on that, let us know. Here is a question from Martina. So going back to, kind of how do these ideas get chosen? How do they come to you? Is with so many heroic stories from the war, how did you choose one in particular to base your stories off of? So like you wrote down the name, why? Like what kind of triggers that, okay, this is going on the list? Feeling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would in some ways quite like to investigate the inner workings of my mind to actually see how that does happen, because so often it is just literally reading a book that 100 other people could read and not notice this one detail in the way that your mind fixes on this one detail. And I don't really know exactly what alchemy takes place between that one detail and my brain, but something happens and it literally starts sparking and going, book idea, book idea, book idea. Whereas everybody else would probably just, move on to the next page. But for me, there's something in there. And it's usually, I do think in a way that being someone who likes to write about what women did during the war and those overlooked stories, I'm lucky in a way that there are so many overlooked women. Unlucky because how did we overlook these women for so many years? But it means that there is, hopefully a pool of stories that I can keep finding for years to come. But I do think it's got to be something that makes you ask why, or it sparks your curiosity in some way. So it's not enough for me to just, read a story about a woman and be interested in that. I've got to it has to make me ask questions. And as soon as my mind starts asking questions, that's when I know, okay, if I want to find out more about this person, then so will the reader. And I guess often it's those figures who have been underwritten about, but someone that everybody already knows, it's much harder to bring a new perspective to that person. Although I do have an idea for a couple of books' time that is quite a well-known and well-written about figure, but I feel like I've got a different angle on that. So fingers crossed I can pull that one off, because I'd quite like to do that. So yeah, it honestly is some strange alchemical process, and I would like to see exactly what neurons light up when my eyes wander over these words that suddenly say to me, this is your next book idea. How does it work for you, Kate?
It's very similar. And I really think that's one of the interesting things about writers is that you could take 100 writers and then 100 different historical, prompts or story ideas or whatever, and each one of us will snag on a different thing. Yeah. And we don't know why, but it does involve a light bulb going off. It's like, wow, I could do something with that. Whereas another story which lights up someone else's mind does nothing for me. So I don't know how that works either. I don't think anybody does. When it comes to, writing about, choosing who to write about, I do look for women's stories, just as Natasha does, because I want to know what were women up to. And, I can find these women in history, but you have to go digging around the edges, because for the most part, history does tend to focus front and center on the doings of men, and, also specifically the doings of white men. So if you're looking for other kinds of stories, you need to dig around the edges. And that is where I tend to go digging. I think especially when it comes to ground that's very well trodden, like World War II, I try to look more and more for stories really that have not been told, because it was a world war. There was a whole world involved. So I want to find the things that are not just a retread of stories that have already been told. So I've been, looking more, that's why I was looking more into Russian history. Stuff about the Russian front did not seem to be as well represented. I'm loving the fact that we're starting to see more stories about the Pacific theater. We're starting to see stories about, Black women in World War II. Kai Alderson's new book about the 688 Battalion. We're starting to see stories about Eastern Europe from authors like Roxanne Valetzos. And that's really great, because I want to see more than just the same ground being trod in, war stories, especially. The thing that I loved about the Riviera House is that, there are a lot of French resistance stories, but this was one, it was about the saving not of people, but of art. And that was new to me, because it is obvious to us as human beings why you risk your life to save other human beings. But the fact is that, and that people have these conversations in your book, Natasha, which I love, is that there's almost an ethical consideration of, do we have a responsibility? Why are we risking our lives to save art? Shouldn't we be putting our effort into saving people instead? And that's a really valid question. So it really raises the issue of how important is art compared to life? And that is such a huge question. And I couldn't recall another French resistance story that dove into that quite as, quite the way that yours did, which was what made this. It's like, okay, this is not just another French resistance story. It is a French resistance story about something different. So that's really the thing when you're looking, I think, especially at World War II stories, is not only it's something that lights your head up, but is it different? Is it treading new ground?
Yeah.
And I think that's important, because we want to make sure that, this history is always bringing something new.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And then also, I think this one should be for both of you as well. From Abraham, do you consider yourself a historian or storyteller first? And how do you find the balance between the two in your work?
Definitely a storyteller. That's why I, lean towards fiction. So I think I said earlier that for me, I need to kind of write a first draft first before I do a lot of research. And I think that helps me in a couple of ways. It means that for me, if I do feel that if I did a lot of research up front, I would be in danger of writing to what the research tells me is possible. Whereas actually in my first draft, I want to be able to let my imagination run wild and run free and just let the story kind of pour out. And so by only doing a kind of a small amount of research up front, it means that I can be the storyteller, and the story always comes first, because you do really want your research to be almost invisible. Readers are drawn to the stories of what people are doing and how they're feeling when they're doing those things. And the fact that it feels authentic and there's all this historical fact around it, it should just kind of be a part of what's going on and not obvious. And I never want the reader to feel like they're, reading a history book. If they want to read a history book, then there are plenty of those. And I'm not a historian. I'm, just someone who makes things up. But like Kate said, there is, when you're writing about what some people refer to as the art Holocaust, that there is that obligation to get it right. It's a subject that has caused a lot of pain and still causes people a lot of pain. So whilst you are a storyteller, you have a responsibility to make sure that when you're stepping into ground like that, you are, doing everything you can. I mean, the papers to do with the Nazi art thefts during the Second World War are spread over 35 different archives in 12 different countries. So there's a massive body of paperwork. And of course, it's not physically possible for one person to go to 35 archives in 12 different countries. So you have to find a way to do enough that you feel like you have been able to honor the things that you're writing about and step sensitively around those areas. So yes, so I would say that I absolutely consider myself to be a storyteller, but someone who tries to understand the obligations that are inherent upon me when I choose to write about things that really happened and things that people really suffered through. How about you, Kate?
Oh, I'm really just going to second all of that. I am absolutely not a historian. I'm a hack. I like to tell stories and I like to entertain, and that is my primary job. The primary job of a storyteller is to entertain, and that is what comes first. Yet, as you say, you wouldn't be writing historical fiction if you didn't have a reverence for the past. So I do try to make sure very, very much that I have my details right, and that if I change anything, I cop to it in the author's note. And ideally speaking, people will finish one of my books or in really any historical fiction, and you want to find out more. So go find the nonfiction from finding the story first. And then ideally it all kind of goes around in one beautiful symbiotic cycle where the fiction leads to the nonfiction, which leads back to the fiction.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a thank you here from Helen. Helen, you're welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I think we covered everything. So,
I'm seeing one question about outlining. Should we have time to tackle that real quick? Or
yeah, well, we already learned that Natasha is a pantser. As it is. What does your outlining process look like for a novel? From both of you.
So it looks non-existent if you live in my house. I have tried. Look, I'm a really organized person in every area of my life. Ask any of my family. I have lists everywhere. And I have tried and tried and tried to apply that same sense of method and organization to my writing. And I have come to the conclusion that my creativity thrives in chaos, which is, for someone who is a control freak like me, it terrifies me. And I hate writing first drafts because I spend the whole time thinking, oh my goodness, this is not going to work out. I'm not going to be able to end it. I don't know what's happening. What if it just I end up throwing all these words in the bin? And so I much prefer rewriting, because rewriting means I have a story there and now I'm just trying to make it better. I'm not trying to discover what that story is. So my first draft is my outline, I suppose. I have to write 100,000 words to work out what the hell I'm doing. Just not very efficient, but anyway. Kate, how about you?
I am a plotter, and I'm getting to be more of a plotter the further I get, with every book that I write. And so I do a lot of outlining and a lot of research to begin with. I do those little like character things where you're interviewing your character and trying to figure out what their wounds and their talents and their flaws are. I do a lot in advance because I am still trying vainly to find a process that results in a first draft that is less than 170,000 words or 200,000 words, and I'm getting there. I feel like I'm getting there. The last book actually was only like 104,000 words and drafted. Okay, I added 30,000 more later, but I'm getting there, I swear. So it's a process. I do like to outline, and I like the outlining process. But really, what it comes down to is that there is no one right way to be a writer. So if anybody had the question of what's advice to give to someone who's starting out, I would say there is no one true way. You can be a plotter, you can be a pantser. It can work. It is truly the right way is whatever works for you.
Absolutely. And we are lucky we've got this wonderful friend, Stephanie Dre, who's put together this amazing outlining and scrivener kind of document that I have started to try to use too, as I try to become a more I'm trying to be a more mature writer who can plan up front. So thanks to Stephanie, I think I'm taking some baby steps in that direction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. We've got some final comments here, just saying thank you both for this great discussion, and you've inspired some travel itches. And see.
Go buy the Riviera House now. It is wonderful.
Yes.
And the rose code.
Yes, and I put the phone number for the store if you want to give us a call. It's 612-822-4611. We are open 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. If you happen to be watching from Minnesota, which I know some of you are, you can stop by anytime, or you can always give us a call to order a book. We ship anywhere, including internationally. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kate and Natasha, for this great discussion, and have a wonderful rest of your evening or day.
Thank you so much for
hosting. Everybody.
Thanks so much, Kate. Bye.
Bye.